We have a set of gauges in Vermont that measure the flow that's produced in the watershed that flows into that given point. In Rutland during Irene, we had somewhere in the neighborhood of 14 or 15,000 cubic feet per second that was going down the Otter Creek at that point in the watershed. We would expect, as the river flows down its watershed and the watershed size continues to get larger and larger, that flow would also correspondingly go up. Here in Middlebury, we were seeing a flow rate of somewhere in the neighborhood of 8,000 cubic feet per second in Middlebury. That's a halving of the flow that we were seeing way upstream in Rutland. So instead of the flow of the river rising as the watershed size increased, we actually saw a dramatic decrease. If the flow is reducing that much, that water has to go somewhere. And where it was going was spilling out of the Otter Creek onto the very large floodplain and wetland complexes that you can find between Rutland and Middlebury.
One of the really important functions of wetlands is that they retain floodwaters, and part of the way that they do this is by letting the water come up, and then with all the duff layer and their regular surface, it holds the water a little bit and the ground gets saturated, and then the water slowly goes down. Where the river has access to the floodplain and when there's wetlands in there, and those hydric soils really hold on to the water. In instances where you don't have that type of a wetland complex, the waters scour and pick up velocity, and the more they scour, the more sediment they pick up, and the more sediment that they pick up, the more erosive force they have. So it just becomes cumulative down the watershed instead of attenuating some of those impacts, the velocity and the volume as well. So putting those wetland complexes in between is like putting a release valve in the system.
There's a tremendous call after a flood event especially to get back in the rivers and create more capacity. We see that all over the state. What's unique, I think, about the Otter Creek Valley is that we don't hear from one year to the next, let's get into the Otter and straighten it or deepen it. I think these wetlands and these floodplains have been protected, and every year they flood. You see the signs, bridge closed, and people go around. The road blockades are there. People almost on an annual basis are accustomed to this phenomena of the floodplains flooded. And so the expectation that we should be changing that, or that's not acceptable, I think accounts for why there isn't the large cry to change the Otter Creek.
Vermont and the country have a no net loss of wetlands policy, but in reality we just haven't seen that. Every day we lose more and more wetlands. Unless something is officially recognized and placed in protection, those wetlands are perpetually at risk. I think since Irene we have a much better understanding, and we have some great examples now of how this works and what this means in terms of even just volume, in terms of mitigating some of these impacts that we had the examples, but we hadn't quantified the reduction in impacts. And now, if you wanted to, you could put a dollar figure on what it costs to preserve a wetland versus what it costs to protect a downtown area. And I think in most instances, you'd see it's a lot more cost efficient to preserve a wetland and have those natural ecosystem services to protect the next downtown than it is to develop the wetland and lose all those functions that we're finding more and more are extremely difficult to recreate as humans any better than they happen naturally.
We have so much infrastructure and so many communities that were built along our rivers. We have to manage many segments of river in Vermont, but it makes it that much more important for the values that we have in our rivers to then give the rivers room upstream and downstream of those managed areas so that they can dissipate the energy of the flood and begin to retain those materials that are so important to our river ecosystems. As a mountainous state, we have these much higher gradient river systems that are not only carrying tremendous flows during floods, but tremendous loads of sediment and debris. And so this tends to move the river channel around during the flood events. And so the greatest flood losses that we incur in Vermont are related to erosion rather than inundation. We get, like every other state, a set of national flood insurance maps that are created by FEMA, Federal Emergency Management Administration, and those maps were created to tell us where the river is going to come out and inundate riparian and floodplain lands. Because so many of our rivers were deepened by human activity or by natural processes, those larger floods never get outside of the banks. And so you can look at inundation maps in the state of Vermont and pick a spot right on the bank of the river and be out of the floodplain. And so a place that may seem perfectly suitable for building, if you're looking at that 1970s map, may be in a place where it could be eroded away during the flood. So we found that our state and our communities needed something more that explained not only this inundation process, but the dynamics of the river and the erosion that might occur. And so we created what we have termed fluvial erosion hazard area maps. We also refer to them as river corridor maps. There are relationships between the size of the river and that meander geometry. And we can calculate what that is, and we can create a set of maps that shows landowners and communities that if we give the river at least this much space, it can evolve to that least erosive form, and that's in our best interests. The first step for a community is to recognize that it has these dynamic streams, that trying to keep them and manage them as static streams is an insufferable cost to the community, and they have to create in their town plan the objective of protecting the room that the stream needs, which then protects the town investments, the town infrastructure, and the property, private and public property that exist along those streams. So it's that town planning process of recognizing erosion hazards and the desire to do something about it. That's the first step. Then a town typically, upon adopting the plan that has created that objective, can take in those mapping tools and other resources to go the next step. And that is typically the adoption of a bylaw or an ordinance that says we as a community are going to limit or not allow further development and encroachment within these delineated river corridors. We have 18 communities in the state that have taken those maps and adopted them into their planning and their zoning to protect those corridors.
If we can get the river moving better from there down, we may not be able to do anything about an Irene, but we can certainly mitigate the 50-year flood maybe, or 25-year, whatever we can do. We'd like to do the maximum of what we can do.
My jurisdiction is the top of the bank down to the channel at the top of the other bank. So any riparian rights, any riparian issues, buffer plantings, putting the walkway, etc. Nice thing would be to take all of these buildings out of the floodplain, but that's not going to happen. Nice thing would be to take out all this pavement parking, but that's not going to happen.
Is there a way to deal with this parking area and bank and provide the river with some more room as it comes through the constriction of the bridge? As it comes out here, it's getting up onto the parking area and taking everything with it. Because this is all bermed here, it pretty much holds the water and pushes it that way. So can we, Shannon was just talking about punching holes through. You want to elaborate on that or
No, I
not?
was just noticing that there's a berm along the edge of the channel here, and rather than removing all the material to remove the berm to let the river, flood into the parking lot and go back into the channel, sometimes we just punch holes in the berm so that the water can access what little floodplain it has easier, rather than containing all the water in the channel, which causes it to have a lot more erosive force.
We're hoping very much to work with more and more communities and take the steps at the community level that they can take to lower their vulnerability during floods. Climate change is a call for many of us to really heighten our efforts in the whole area of adaptation. We have to make our communities, our roads, our bridges more resilient to these increased flood events. They're going to happen more frequently. The intensity of these storms, a term we call microburst storms that bring anywhere from 6 to 10 inches of rain over the course of several hours. Our roads and our communities are going to be maintained at a great cost if we don't invest in infrastructure that can coexist with these types of increased peak runoff events.
If you look at a culvert as just something that passes water, and you size it just to pass water, you're not really taking into account a stream. And streams normally move sediment, they move material, woody debris, rocks, gravel. It's constant. And when you disrupt that, you cause all kind of issues upstream and downstream. That's why you see a lot of towns constantly rip-rapping around culverts, because there are constantly issues associated with culverts that are just passing water and not functioning as a stream should.
So we're starting with a channel of about 4 inches wide, and we're going to put in a 1-inch culvert. What this shows is it's demonstrating how an undersized culvert can change our flow in the channel and our sediment. So you'll notice downstream, almost instantaneously, we're starting to get a scour hole created. This is because we're changing our velocity from upstream to downstream. It has more power to erode. You'll notice the impoundment that's starting to happen upstream because our channel width is now constrained from 4 inches to having to pass through 1 inch. And so during a flood, you're asking that road embankment to basically be a dam. Typically they're not designed to hold water back behind them. The road embankments are starting to fail, and we saw a lot of this type of failure in Irene, where the road embankment basically becomes saturated, or the water begins to pipe beside the culvert, or it becomes overtopped and then fails. And you can see the amount of sediment and water that was behind it when that fails, it has a surge charge that can start doing a lot of damage downstream.
Culverts in Rochester, not unlike a lot of the culverts in towns, were affected kind of on the side streams, the tributaries, kind of high up. In Marshbrook, you have a culvert high up in the watershed on North Hollow. It had 2 30-inch pipes side by side, and it with about 15 to 16 foot of fill over the top of them. So it's basically a small dam. And when it failed, all that rush of water and debris and sediment hit the next pipe, which was a 15-foot bottomless arch. That failed, it was undersized. It flooded the house beside it, went down, took out a bridge, and then took out a house that his landowner is now going through the buyout process. And all because of one culvert. It's still a culvert, but if you size it right and install it correctly, the stream functions, at least better than it did. And with that function, you get flood resiliency, you get that sediment transport and that debris, woody debris transport.